Roger Walsh, real pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much. I've been a fan of your work for quite some time, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity.
You're a psychiatrist,
Right.
but judging by the Buddha behind you in shot, you're not a traditional psychiatrist.
Yeah, I'm a little out there.
You're quite a big figure in the integral world, connected to Ken Wilber. And we recently put out a couple of films, well, 3 films actually, with Ken Wilber. One about Jordan Peterson and the evolution of thought, and one about the integral dark web, the intellectual dark web. And it seems like a very good time to kind of look at the legacy of integral and to ask, in some sense, we're certainly at a point where what was a kind of new atheist hegemony in culture seems like it's shifting somewhat. Like the huge kind of phenomenon of Jordan Peterson is one sort of sign that these religious and spiritual themes are now allowed to be talked about in polite company again. What do you make of that? Have you been sort of watching the way that things are shifting in the culture? And what do you make of where we're at right now?
Well, there has been a shift, and I think one can look at it from various perspectives, but from my perspective, one of the most powerful forces in this shift is that now, for the first time in the West for centuries, it's possible for the majority of people to have direct spiritual experiences as opposed to simply listening to sermons and getting their religion secondhand. And that's happened from a variety of different sources and practices. The initial opening came in the 60s with the introduction of psychedelics to the West. And for the first time in centuries, a significant percentage of the Western population was having dramatic altered states of consciousness, some of which were very problematic, but also some of which were very profound spiritual experiences. And they demonstrated to an unsuspecting Western world that we have available to us a far wider array of states of consciousness, of possibilities, of potentials, of spiritual possibilities than our culture had appreciated was at all possible. So that was the initial opening. Then, of course, there was the convergence of cultures, first with a number of young people going to the East and learning various contemplative practices, bringing those back. So there was this wave of contemplative practices coming into the West, starting with meditation and yoga, but also, for example, shamanic traditions. So now we've had this enormous influx of practices by which anyone who's willing to do the work can have these experiences for themselves. And this is having many effects, one of which has not been recognized, but I think is very important, and that is that our culture is shifting what anthropologists call a monophasic culture to a polyphasic culture. Monophasic cultures are ones which derive their worldview and understanding of reality and ourselves from a single state of consciousness, the usual waking state. But polyphasic cultures derive their understanding of ourselves and the world and our possibilities from a variety of states, including dreaming and reverie and contemplation and meditation and yoga. So we are really going through a dramatic worldview change, which really hasn't been appreciated as yet. It's kind of an inner revolution that is happening around us and in us, but somehow the culture hasn't quite woken up to what's happening.
I'd love to get a very concise history of your kind of biography. I understand that you were originally quite a sort of strong materialist classic psychiatrist, and you kind of shifted over time and to where you're happy to be filmed with the Buddha behind you.
Yes, I've become everything I once thought was ridiculous. Yes, I started off as very hardcore materialist, scientific reductionist. I got an MD and a PhD, and science was my God, and laboratories were my church, and I thought anything religious or spiritual was pure nonsense and archaic, magic, mythic. But then when I actually went into my own psychotherapy and then started doing contemplative practices myself, more out of curiosity than anything else, the more I got into them, the more experiences I had, the more my worldview was just called into questions. And I just had experiences that just did not fit in the conventional worldview. And they kept happening. And they kept deepening. And I just wrestled enormously, and it was a very challenging period, really trying to, changing worldviews is not easy. And I really had to wrestle for a long time, but eventually I came to, over time, more in what I now regard as a more encompassing framework, of which I still have great appreciation for science. But I also see the material reductionistic worldview that usually goes with it as not necessarily following at all, and that it can be part of a much larger worldview, a worldview based on multiple states of consciousness, on multiple developmental stages, on human possibilities that just don't fit in the conventional framework. So it's been a long journey, but it feels like now I can make sense of these things and hold things in a bigger framework.
And you mentioned before that you've watched quite a lot of our content, so you must be kind of aware of this, the idea of a kind of a new emergent conversation. What is it that excites you about that, or what is it that kind of draws you to that?
Well, I think there are several things. One is simply the opportunity that you and others provide for in-depth conversations instead of the 5 minutes of standard media. So that's one thing. I think the exploratory nature of the conversations is really wonderful. It's as I look at your programs, it's people who are really exploring rather than expositing, this is the way things are. So that's very exciting. I think there's an awareness in the people you interview of a bigger picture, trying to make sense of this. Your audience and your interviewees seem to be very aware of the contemporary issues we face. So this is, the conversations are cognizant of the very real issues we face and the bigger picture and the opportunities. And then there's the call, for example, with your guest Jordan Peterson, the call to responsibility, to step up and assume our own roles and contributions here and acknowledge we're not helpless victims, and that yes, we have rights, but we also have responsibilities. So all of those things are very appealing, and the fact that our conversation has been about integral, that I think in looking at your interviewees that they're struggling their way towards a more integral perspective, and that I think is very promising and exciting too.
And one of the big differences now is that there is sort of there's real scientific interest in mindfulness, in psychedelics, in these kind of alternative states of consciousness, and the potential for them perhaps to be integrated. This is something that we've kind of really felt, and I think most of the people who are following our channel most intensely kind of feel like there's an emergent conversation that's partly facilitated by the internet, and it feels like it's going somewhere. There's a kind of teleology to it, and that teleology, we had John Vervaeke, a professor of psychology in Toronto, on the channel quite recently, and he also agreed that this teleology of the conversation is integrating all the wisdom traditions in a much more conscious and scientific way. Again, after the new atheists had this kind of stranglehold on saying all of this stuff was just nonsense, and everyone being scared of taking it seriously for being attacked by the outriders of the new atheists. Now there's a chance for something integral to emerge, and why we were very interested in Ken Wilber and introducing Ken Wilber to this particular conversation that we're hosting is that he got there many years ago. And integral theory is all about kind of the integration of all of these different forms of knowledge. What do you feel that integral has to offer to this new emergent conversation?
Well, I think the main thing integral has to offer is it provides a framework in which we can hold and see how these different forms of knowledge, different disciplines, East and West, spiritual and material fit together in a coherent way, that they're not necessarily conflictual, that they each can mutually facilitate and deepen and enrich the other. And they also speak to, it also speaks to the confusion that so many people face in the midst of the dramatic changes, the explosion of knowledge, information overload, that we're all in some ways struggling to make sense of the dramatic shifts, both individual and collective and global and ecological, that all of us face. So integral is what's called a meta theory, that is a theory which brings together and makes sense of and integrates multiple theories. And so it gives us this map for seeing how these things relate. So I think that's its primary gift.
And do you think, I mean, you've been involved with Integral for a long time, do you think it's fair to say that it hasn't had the impact that some people hoped that it would have done in the world?
I think in some ways that that's true. One can look at it from two sides. You know, different movements usually go through a period of flourishing and then fading. At the moment, Integral is still flourishing, so we don't know how wide its impact will continue to be. One can say it's had a pretty dramatic influence. I was last year at the Integral European Conference, over 600 people from 39 countries. That's, by international conferences, that's pretty impressive. And on the other side, one can say, for example, in the world of academia, it really hasn't had the impact it had. I'd very much hoped it would provide a meta framework for cross-disciplinary discussion, but Ken and many in the integral world have chosen to write in a style, predominantly in a style, and use publishers which are not traditional academics, and academics are pretty snooty. If you don't publish in the right journals and with the right publishers, they don't even read you. So it has not had the made the academic inroads I had hoped it would.
What do you think can be learned from the successes and the failures of Integral so far?
Well, many things. Just off the top of my head, one is the hunger for a meaning-making system, something that can offer a way of holding all the apparently conflictual pieces of information and cultural dynamics and psychological issues that all of us are facing in this new era, not to mention the change. It offers I think it shows the hunger, which I think is innate to human beings, for a contemplative depth. It also shows and leads us to a recognition of human possibilities. I mean, I think all of us have had the sense that there's got to be more to life than this. And so here's a framework that makes sense of that and shows, yes, there is a lot more to life than a conventional life. There's post-conventional development. There are altered states and higher states of consciousness. There are different virtues that can be developed. So I think it shows how much we need these kind of meta frameworks to make sense of what's going on at this time.
And I mean, something I've seen quite a bit on the sort of various integral forums that I'm part of is it seems very easy for a conversation to kind of degenerate into who's more integral, kind of the sort of integral one-upmanship. Yeah. That's always been the case, hasn't it? Kind of like that's a very second tier, that's a very first tier attitude or whatever. Why does that happen, and how do you avoid it?
Well, the problem with nice theories and with good religions is they're practiced by human beings. And human beings are notoriously hard to change and have difficulty maturing, and will use most anything. The ego will use almost anything for its own self-aggrandizement. If we think in developmental terms, particularly Jean Piaget, the developmental psychologist, he made a very important distinction, recognition that whenever we get new information, we can either assimilate it, that is, fit it into, squish it into, in a Procrustean way, our current belief system and worldview, or we can accommodate to it, that is, we can alter, we can open, we can change our worldview to hold this larger picture. And the automatic default position is assimilation. It's like, how do I take this nice piece of information and fit it into my ego belief system and use it for my to show my superiority, etc. This is a human nature at work. And the redeeming feature of integral ideas and contemplative practices and any good growth community is that they have a telos, a drive towards some sort of growth, a kind of self-correction in there. So all of us will fall into misusing these things, and hopefully we'll grow out of that.
Mm. But there's always a danger with hierarchy. I mean, we're in a kind of, I mean, one of Ken's brilliant kind of insights was that we're in a kind of green as a mode of consciousness tends to obliterate all hierarchies in the name of fairness, and what ends up happening is we're kind of lost in flatland and we don't know which way is up and we don't know where we're going, which actually overlaps really well with what Jordan Peterson has been saying. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's always dangers with bringing those hierarchies back in, are there not? Because then how do you avoid getting locked in this sort of, well, I'm more developed than you, kind of almost like there's a danger there as well of bringing them back in. How do you avoid those dangers?
Yes, there are dangers in both. Given that we have egos, there are dangers in most things. How do we avoid those? Much the same way as we foster psychological maturation and growth with anything. First, having a commitment to truth-telling, being in a community in which one has a shared commitment to learning and growth and being called on one's games, acknowledging the fact that we tend to, all of us are prey to this, and if you see me doing this, please call me out on it. And fessing up when we notice ourselves doing it. I mean, there are lots of other practices, but those are some of the immediate ones that come to mind. And acknowledging we will fall into it, and if we're really committed to learning and growing and being integral, then we will acknowledge that and cop to it.
And there's this sort of sense of the map is not the territory. And I mean, that's said within integral, but it seems that confusing the two just happens over and over and over again. Is there something about the way we interpret the world that means it's almost impossible not to make that confusion all the time?
Yes. I think this is a fundamental recognition of psychology, that we tend to confuse our worldviews with the world. That takes a significant amount of maturity. In fact, it seems to come online at certain post-conventional developmental stages, the capacity to step back and recognize one's beliefs as simply beliefs. And it's very hard to really immerse oneself in a theory and adopt it as a working framework without it becoming an unquestioned belief. And a major part of psychological and spiritual growth is disidentifying from one's belief system, recognizing beliefs instead of, so that one is able to look at them rather than look through them. And that's a major psychological and developmental challenge for all of us, no matter what the theory.
And one of the other criticisms that Jamie Wheel put forward was, and the way he framed it was saying that one of the key psychological insights of integral was that Western psychological models had no place for non-duality. They didn't make space for the spiritual realizations. But Eastern models often didn't have a space for understanding of the shadow, the sort of psychological material that Jung would call the shadow. And integral had this understanding of bringing the two together, but then there were a series of spiritual teachers who Integral was linked to, most prominently Andrew Cohen, but also Genpo Roshi and who's the guy who was in Mark Gaffney, who had scandals of one side or another, and his criticism was, even though it had that model, it was still prey to all of the shadow material in some of the most prominent spiritual teachers.
Yeah. Okay, I think there's a lot in what you said. Maybe I just step back to the presupposition. I think it's not that the Eastern traditions ignored shadow material. More interestingly, their primary epistemological tool was contemplation, and contemplation or introspection does not reveal psychodynamic defenses and shadow. It's hard to recognize that in oneself. It's much easier to recognize it in another person. Why do you not see the log in your own eye, but see the splinter in others, as Jesus said? But the West, with its psychology and psychotherapy, was able to investigate that. But the Western psychology not only didn't recognize non-duality, it didn't recognize post-conventional stages or states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness. So it was a much wider issue here. So Integral, yes, brought those together in a new way. But the implication of your question is, well, okay, it has all this, but why do some people associated with the Integral movement fall into these scandals? And I think we need to subdivide the question a couple of ways. One is this a reflection on the validity of the theory, or is it a reflection on the misuse of the theory, or is it that some smart people with their own personality foibles were drawn to Integral and would have screwed up anyway? So, the question of the validity of the theory is still a work in process. I think it will take decades of both experimental work and research before we really can evaluate integral theory effectively and fully. Secondly, does this theory, as opposed to other worldviews, lend itself to fostering or supporting pathology? I don't think so. I don't see that. In fact, I think it has some mitigating elements that really foster well-being and respect and ethicality. So I don't think that's the issue. But can there be some very smart people who are flawed human beings, in some way like the rest of us, and perhaps more so in other ways, that are drawn to Integral? Certainly. I don't think that necessarily speaks to the theory itself. I think the fact that there have been some people associated with the movement who have screwed up badly, I don't necessarily think that reflects on the theory. It might, but I don't think it necessarily does. It may. I think it certainly speaks to the fact that one can be integrally informed and still screw up royally. I don't think integral or any theory or any practice is a guarantee that one won't screw up. I mean, human beings we're all very flawed, and from my own perspective, they're going to be screw-ups, and what can we do to minimize them?
Why I think this is a really important question is because it's one of the reasons that people have real concerns around spirituality, full stop. Like the idea that all gurus are kind of frauds, or like that's a real concern about a lot of people who are skeptical of spirituality. So I guess why that happened and how we stop that happening is something of huge importance if, like me and like you, we think that spirituality is one of the key things that we need to integrate into the culture.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Clearly, there have been abuses, and starting from the very early days of the influx of Eastern teachers into this country, we've had a succession of guru downfalls, of course. on the other side, we need to acknowledge that media loves putting people on pedestals and then taking them down. So, how widespread that, what percentage of people that was, I don't know. But I think the key question you're getting at is, what can we do to minimize these kind of very disturbing abuses and misuses of power? And I think there are several things. First off, we need to acknowledge that hierarchies are inherent, but some hierarchies are problematic. And when you have a person at the top of the hierarchy with no peers, that's dangerous. When someone doesn't get feedback, you need danger money. It's really risky. So that's one thing. Another thing is when we have any cult-like elements. Cults are organizations in which there's a hierarchical system where information is limited, where openness is limited, where criticism is limited, etc., and where there are coercive power structures. So any of those can be problematic, and there is research coming out, including some in Integral, on what are the problematic features of, what are the distinguishing characteristics of problematic organizations, spiritual organizations, as opposed to more healthy ones. And clearly some of them, where you have, for example, just to name one, where you have a dependence on a charismatic leader as opposed to what's called a technical focus, that is a focus on practices as opposed to the leader. That's a warning sign. So, and we have some information on that. So I think that's coming, and we need to also, all encourage each other to practice ethics as fully as we possibly can. Because I was in a group which studied cults, and one of the things I took away from that is a couple of warning signs. One, when you think you have a unique purpose and you alone have the means to save the world, watch out. Second, when you start justifying the means in terms from the end justifies the means, watch out. And third, watch out when you start making ethical slips, because the second one comes a lot easier than the first, and the third comes easier than the second. And it's like these little things just cascade. So those were some of the things I took out, and I think it's a call for all of us to step up and take responsibility for ourselves and our lives and not give our authority away.
Some of the comments that I've seen about the films that we've put out have said that, and especially now that we have this kind of networked, we have a very different world even than 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago when many of Ken's books were coming out. And now we have the potential through this new digital media for an emergent conversation, like nodes in a network finding each other and boosting each other's signal, and it's far more organic. And in some sense, some people are saying, is this more of the time for a spontaneous emergence of what we might call a sort of integral consciousness or a second-tier consciousness, one which is able to understand paradox, to kind of move beyond the sort of simplistic ideological thinking of the past? Could this be Integral's time in some sense?
Well, I certainly hope so. I'm not sure I'd put a huge amount of money on it. I think if we look at the culture and globe as a whole, where there are so many competing dynamics and so many different movements, both progressive and regressive, I certainly hope and believe there is a telos. I mean, if we look across history, there you do see a developmental evolutionary growth in maturity and consciousness, I think, across time. However, we also see that development, evolution is very dependent on social and economic structures and coherence and continuity. Look at the fall of the Roman Empire. In 1,000 years it took humankind to climb back after the loss of that social underlying system. So, and we live right now on a very endangered planet where, we've got ecological systems that are crashing. We've got, the constant threat of ever more powerful weapons. We've got all sorts of issues ahead of us. where the very question of human survival, and certainly civilizational survival, is in question. And there are a growing number of people that I see, and probably you do too, who are experiencing what is sometimes described as survival, survival panic, or extinction panic. So there are multiple dynamics going on, and we don't know how it's going to turn out, but what it always seems to come back to in the face of cultural, social, global challenges is the question, what can I do? And below that, what's the most strategic thing I can do? And I think that's the koan of our time. And it's really important to recognize that question, what can I do and what's the most strategic thing I can do, they're a particular kind of question. They're wisdom questions. There are two kinds of questions. There are knowledge questions. Is it raining outside? Go outside, take a look. No, end of question. But wisdom questions are like koans. Each time you ask them, they take us deeper into yourself, deeper into the question, deeper into reality. So the question, what can I do, is really a wisdom question that calls us to keep asking, keep reflecting, keep looking to see what is our most effective contribution. And I think Integral certainly has a role in that. Integral can provide us with a framework for seeing how best to draw on multiple resources, to acknowledge the possibilities and potentials within us, to honor the deeper spiritual nature that we all have, and to hold that context as we look for our unique contribution in addressing these enormous challenges we face.
Roger, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the good work you do.